There were many religious folk tales and myths in the 1st and 2nd millennium BCE. The Greeks, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Indians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians. There were Ugaritic myths. There were Sicilian, Mesopotamian, Sumerian. So many of these myths and foundational stories with all sorts of clearly mythical and magical events in them, none of which we take seriously on historical grounds. None of which you take seriously on historical grounds. The gods on the top of Mount Olympus, for example. The divine birth of Hercules. All these things that we all know, come on, that's mythology. The ancient Israelites had their own version of a foundational story. There was a first man made from mud. His name was Adam. Then the woman was pulled out of his side from his rib. According to science, by the way, according to the fact of evolution, there could not have been an Adam and an Eve. That's impossible. There could not have been a first man and a first woman. But even if there were, they would have come out of Africa, not out of the Middle East. This foundational story was clearly written by people who didn't know much about science or biology. There's a magic tree in a pristine garden. There's a talking snake who tempts the woman. By the way, if you look up the word fable in the dictionary, you will see, for example, here's American Heritage. A fable is a usually short narrative making an edifying or cautionary point, often employing as characters animals that speak and act like human beings. The Israelite story has a talking animal. It has two talking animals, actually. There was Balaam's ass. Animals don't talk, by the way. They don't have vocal cords. That's one of the ways we know this is a mythical story. There's this unforgiving angel with a flaming sword barring entry into the garden. There's an unforgiving God character who destroys every living thing in a worldwide flood, for which there is no evidence, by the way. There's cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed with fire and brimstone. A woman was turned into salt. There was the story of the captivity in Egypt by these Israelite slaves. Sticks turning into snakes. The Nile River turning into blood. A one-day exit of 2 or 3 million people from Egypt into the Exodus. The Exodus story, the crossing of a Red Sea, which, by the way, was totally unnecessary. You can get to the Sinai Peninsula without having to go all the way down south across the Red Sea. That was clearly added as a mythical story because there were a lot of other sea-ocean crossing stories and other mythologies too, so the Israelites wanted to have one of their own. They could have got there much more easily than having to go down and cross this Red Sea. There's a pillar of fire. There's a burning bush that talks. There's a race of giants called the Nephilim. A lot of these mythologies had giants in their stories. There's food falling from the sky. There were trillions of quail that were blown up out of the ocean to feed these people. There was water that came from a rock that was being struck. By the way, the Persian god Mithra shot an arrow into a rock and water came out of it too. Moses hit the rock with a rod. Very similar parallel stories that were going on back then. There's clothing that did not wear out for 40 years. There's this mountain in the Sinai Peninsula from which a lawgiver goes up to the top to get the law, just like the Greeks went up to the top of Olympus. Many other mythologies back then, they had to go up, as if God were a physical kind of a being that has a high and a low, as if he had to go up to the top of something to get to this being. This God of these Israelites kills all the followers of Korah by opening the earth and swallowing them up. That looks like a big action hero movie. Wouldn't that be something to see on TV? They disagree with Moses' authority, just like Luther disagreed with the Pope. So what did Moses do? You're dead. That's the story in there. Korah and 250 of his followers. There's a massive military conquest of Canaan for which there is no historical evidence. Where are all those implements of warfare? Where are all the chariots? Where are all these Israelites? These captive slaves suddenly became these fierce warring soldiers and went in and did all of this killing. There's no evidence for any of that. God kills the Amorites with these meteorites from the sky, and then he makes the sun and the moon stand still. Human skeletons that are dead come back to life and walk around. A disembodied hand floats in the air and writes on the wall, many, many tekel ufarsim. And on and on and on and on. These Israelites have these stories that sound, quite frankly, and if you're honest, You have to admit, compared with other mythologies, they sound quite mythological, don't they? They are not the kinds of things that we would ordinarily say, yeah, that happened. Like, what if I told you, when I came up here to this building, a black and white cat came up to me and said, Dan, welcome to the University of Whitewater. I hope you have a great time here. How many of you believe that happened? Why not? Are you all a bunch of skeptics? Why don't you believe that story? What if I wrote it down? A talking cat spoke to me. Would you believe it? Why don't you believe it? Are you doubters? You don't believe it because you know cats don't talk. It's a crazy story. It's an outrageous story. And you're much more likely to think that I'm making it up, right, than that it actually happened. Well, if you're likely to think that about me, why not think that about the ancient Israelites? They made it up. There is no archaeological evidence for any of those stories that I just told you. Any of them. You will find archaeological evidence for certain cities and certain groups of people. But if anyone should care about this foundational myth, the Jews themselves and the Israelis should care. But did you know that almost all rabbis will tell you the stories of the Old Testament are allegorical? They were not historical. In the Jewish temple in Madison, Wisconsin, where I played the piano once for a wedding, I looked at the Torah, and right in the preface it says, these stories are not to be taken literally. These are just stories. They're like legends, right? The Jews themselves treat these stories as legends, as myths. The Israelis over in Israel, if anyone would care about the foundational story of the nation of Israel, the Israeli scholars themselves should. And yet the archaeologists over there are throwing up their hands saying, nope, there's nothing. None of these stories has any archaeological evidence at all. Israel Finkelstein, for example, who teaches there in Israel, they had access to the Sinai Peninsula. They were able to look and see, was there a group of 2 or 3 million people wandering in that peninsula for 40 years with all their cattle and all their tents? No, there was not. The Israeli archaeologists and historians themselves agree that the story is mythological. It did not happen. Where is the evidence for that supposed Exodus? Where's the evidence for the huge military conquest of Canaan? Where are all the bones of the thousands of giants that supposedly lived during that time? The Nephilim that scared the Israelites so much that they had to huddle back. Even though they had this huge God, they were afraid of the giants for 40 years.